Hi, welcome to another episode here at Bible Backdrop. Today we're going into the Crucifixion. And before we open up here, I just want to tell you it's not going to be easy. We're going to talk about the true events that happened to Jesus on that cross. And although part of us may not even want to know, I think it is so essential for us to know, because we become so grateful for what Jesus did for us when we understand what he thoroughly went through on that cross. So although these next couple minutes might be difficult, I encourage you to stay engaged, because this is the living, breathing Son of God that did this for you and I. And if you want to read along with us in the scriptures, it's Matthew 27, verses 28 through 44, Mark 15, verses 17 through 32, Luke 23, verses 26 through 43, and John 19, verses 16 through 27. Now, where we left off in our last video, Pilate had just washed his hands and handed over Jesus as he stood there in the purple robe and the crown of thorns on his head. An entire regiment of soldiers is now with Jesus to help the chief priests pull this off. And that would be 200 soldiers is at their disposal to help make this happen. Now, one of the first things we have to understand is when Jesus was put this robe on his back, that he had just gotten the 40 lashes, the scourging with the cat of nine tails. And so his back itself would be so torn up. It's as if the stripes where that whip would have hit him, melded with the glass and all that was within the whip, would have torn up the back of Jesus in a stripe-like fashion. But we also have to understand the back itself is one of the most vascular systems in the body. And so blood would be everywhere. And as they put this robe on him at noon in the heat of day there in Jerusalem, and then all of a sudden they rip it off. I want you to understand that although that may look so simple in the scriptures that as this robe went into his body and it started drying as the blood started drying with the heat of the day, just ripping it off would cause such excruciating pain. And then the weight of the cross was put on him. 300 pounds would be put on his back, the back that was just beaten, the back that his blood was just flowing out of him. And he couldn't carry the cross right away. Why? Because we have to understand the loss of blood that Jesus would have gone through just for the scourging. And here, his body is already weak as they put this cross on him. But I want you to also understand something else. You see, the reason that they made people carry up the cross, carry their own cross, because it was an admission of guilt. And although Jesus died on the cross for you and I, he was not guilty of our sin. No, we are still guilty of our own sin. And I love how God did not allow this symbolism to take place of Jesus carrying the cross, because he was not guilty. He died on that cross, but you and I are the ones that are still truly guilty of that sin. And the symbolism didn't even take place as Jesus couldn't carry this cross with the blood loss and the pain that he was going through. And Simon from Cyrene was walking, and they pull him in. Both Matthew, Mark, and Luke talk about this guy. And they pull him in as he's walking in from the country and immediately tell him to carry Jesus' cross. Now, let me tell you a little bit about this guy. You see, Cyrene is in northern Africa. And he was probably part of the thousands that would be coming into Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover that day. Now, understanding that Cyrene was 783 miles from Jerusalem, if he walked 4 miles per hour, and if he walked 8 hours per day, it would have taken Simon 32 days to walk to Jerusalem. What dedication. But yet the moment he's walking into the city, he is immediately grabbed and asked to carry this man's cross. Mark 15:21 mentions his sons, Alexander and Rufus. And the reason that I love that Mark mentions his son is because these two men became part of the early church. In other words, Simon may have come in to celebrate the Passover like a normal Jewish man would have done, but his life was changed in this moment as he carries his Savior's cross. In fact, we actually can look at history and understand that Cyrene itself became part of the early church. It became the early center of Christianity, as 100,000 Judean Jews would be present within the early church. It was a hotbed for the Christian movement, and I believe a lot had to do with Simon from Cyrene as he carried Jesus' cross. Understanding as we go through the scriptures, it would have been something like Jesus walking first up the hill, Simon carrying this 300-pound cross behind him, 2 other criminals walking close by carrying their crosses, and then the scriptures tell us that a mob of women came from behind, grief-stricken women crying and wailing at what is going on to Jesus. And I love how Jesus stops. In the scriptures it says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me," he says to them, "but weep for yourselves and for your children." You see, he knew at this moment that it would soon be over for him, but life was going to go on for them, that life was going to be hard for them as they still stood as Christ followers. And not only that we actually look at history, and just 40 years later, Jerusalem is going to lay in ruin. The temple is going to be destroyed in 70 AD after Titus comes in with the Roman guard and takes out Jerusalem. You see, life was about ready to get super hard. And so he's saying, don't cry for me. Weep for yourselves, as they walked up this hill towards Mount Moriah. Now, let me tell you about this hill that they're walking up. Mount Moriah, sound familiar? It's where Abraham took Isaac when God called him to kill his son, but yet all of a sudden provides a lamb in the thicket for that sacrifice. That's the same hill. It's the same mountain. It's the same mountain where Solomon built the first temple for God, right there by Mount Moriah. The highest point on Mount Moriah is called Golgotha, which in Latin is Calvary. You see, this hill is just not any hill. This hill overlooks Jerusalem, so that if somebody being crucified on this cross, it would be seen from all of Jerusalem. As he's walking up this hill, he's still weak and can barely walk. Matthew and Mark mention that wine mingled with myrrh and gall, both the same thing, was customary to give. And it was a cheap Roman vinegar wine. It was a vinegar wine, and it was drugged. The gall in the myrrh was to dull the senses. It was a drug in itself. And as they offer it to Jesus, he starts smelling it before he drinks it, and he smells the myrrh in it, and he immediately refuses it. Now, we have to understand when you have such a loss of blood that one of the first things that happens is you get thirsty. So it wasn't that Jesus wasn't thirsty. It was the fact that he was refusing because he was not going to dull the senses. He was going to feel this for all that it's worth. So you and I can't say, oh, he didn't really feel the pain that he went through because he took the Roman wine vinegar with myrrh. No, he refused it because he was going to know that he was going to walk through this thoroughly. And as we go into this, I want to read something over you because I'm afraid I'm going to mess this up. But I found this, and I think that this is exactly what happened as we understand what really went on during the crucifixion. So if you would listen to this, Simon is ordered to place the cross on the ground. This is when they get to the top of Calvary. Jesus would have been quickly thrown backwards, his shoulders against the wood on the cross on the ground. The legionnaire, the person who was there to crucify Jesus, would feel for the depression in Jesus' wrists, right here. And he would drive a heavy, square, wrought iron nail through the wrists deep into the wood. Quickly, he would move to the other side, and he would repeat the action, but he would be careful not to pull the arms too tight, but allow some flexation and movement. And they would move the cross into place with just the arms up. And they would take the left foot and they would press it backwards against the right foot. And at both feet extended with toes down, a nail would be driven through the arch of each, but leaving the knees moderately flexed. And the victim would now be considered crucified. And he slowly sags on that cross, and the nails in his wrists would provide a fiery shooting pain. The fingers and the arms that actually send straight to the brain. And the nails in his hands are putting pressure on the median nerves. And he pushes himself upward to avoid the stretching torment. He would place full weight on the nails on his feet. Again, that searing agony of the nails tearing through the nerves between the metatarsal bones of his feet. The pain you and I could never probably even understand was going on in that moment as Jesus yells in Luke 23, verse 34, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing." Oh, you guys, we still need that forgiveness, don't we? Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And we have to understand that we are fully responsible for the cost of our sin that drove those spikes through his hands and through his feet. Pilate places a sign on the top of the cross that says, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." And it was normal to do a cross on the sign, a sign over the cross. That was something you customarily did. It would say something like murderer, or you created a rebellion, or something like that. It would say exactly what you did. But you see, Pilate, if we remember from the last episode, Pilate didn't find Jesus guilty of anything. And so simply it said over the cross, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." But I believe there was a little bit of a smirk on Pilate's face when he wrote that. Why? Because it was a little smack in the face of the religious officials. If we remember, the chief priests were saying said he was the Son of God. But here, Pilate wrote King of the Jews as if the chief priests are killing their own man who came to be their king, their physical, earthly king. They're killing him because they love Rome. Could you imagine the little bit of smirk on Pilate's face as he wrote that? I'll label it as if you're killing your own king. And the chief priest came to him and said, "No, change it, I am the king." And they didn't want it to suggest that they're crucifying their own king, but one that was trying to attempt to overthrow Rome. But Pilate wouldn't change it. And it was written in Greek, the language of intellect. It was written in Latin, the language of the government. It was written in Hebrew, which was the language of the religion. So no matter what religion you wrote or you spoke, it would be known that Jesus was king. But then as he hung on that cross, they started casting lots for his clothes below him. Now, what a shameful mark of humiliation when they say you don't even deserve the clothes on your back. You see, 500 years earlier, in Psalm 22:18, David would prophesy this: "They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garments." And you know what's crazy is the chief priest would have read this in Psalms. They would have studied this verse, and it came to fruition right here. You see, each Jewish male wore 5 articles of clothing: a headband, sandals, an inner cloak, kind of like a nightshirt, and then the outer tunic. And they had divided up all of his clothes until they got to the outer tunic. Because why? They were casting lots for this because this held value. Now, casting lots was something, we don't really know exactly what that was, but many people describe it as like a sticks and stones that you would utilize. It was almost like reading the results as they would lay there, kind of like flipping a coin for us now. But we understand it as, obviously, it was called casting lots. We don't exactly know how the game was played. But they were basically playing a game for this outer tunic. Why? Because it didn't have a seam. It was beautifully constructed garment. Anytime you had a garment that didn't have a seam within it, it was worth money. But that type of garment would have been made for Jesus. Why? Because in Exodus 20, we read that that type of outer tunic that had no seams was actually made for the high priests. It was used during temple service. And here, Jesus was wearing it. And we understand Jesus as the chief priest of this new covenant. And here, Jesus is dying on the cross, watching them below them as these men simply play games for his clothes. But they're not the only ones at the foot of that cross. The scriptures actually tell us that the women were present along with John, the disciple, at the cross. We see Sister Mary, Matthew 27, verses 54. She had been a follower of Jesus' ministry. We see Mary Magdalene, the one in Luke 8, 1-3, that was healed from demons. We see his mother Mary. 4 women at the foot of the cross. And let me tell you, there's this idea that we have today that it was easy for them. They were allowed to be there. And I have to tell you, although these women's words counted for nothing, although the women were intended to be invisible, although they were treated horribly and their words counted for nothing, much overlooked in society, You see, it was still not a safe place for them to be. Why? Because we also see in the scriptures, when a woman committed adultery, what were the chief priests going to do to her? They were going to stone her, to kill her. Stoning was how they killed people in the Jewish Sanhedrin Supreme Court. You see, we have to understand that they were not above killing women for doing something they shouldn't have been doing. And being a supporter of Jesus was something they should not have been doing. And then we have to understand these women are actually risking their lives to be at the foot of the cross because they themselves were not over being put to death for what they were doing. But they stayed there. They couldn't speak out. They couldn't act out. But they couldn't do anything. Their power was limitless or was limited. But they could be. They could be present. They could be at his feet. And we see in John 19, verses 26 to 27, he says, "Dear women," he's talking to Mary, "here is your son." And he said to the disciple, John, "Here is your mother." And I love that because here Jesus is speaking in some of his last words. He's saying he's taking care of Mary. He's not forsaking his earthly duty of being the eldest son as Joseph has already passed. He is taking care of his mother as compassion is pouring out of him as he is hanging on this cross. Matthew 27:39 says, people are yelling at the cross, "Save yourself," mocking Jesus as he hung there. Can you imagine his muscles tense, trying to breathe as he put pressure on his hands and pressure on his feet? But we have to understand that if he would have listened to these people, he couldn't have been the one that ransomed so many. And as I dig into this, I think we need to understand as these people yelled, "Save yourself," maybe perhaps there was some truth in that. Why? Because there was no question whether Jesus had done miracles. There's no question whether Jesus actually raised Lazarus from the dead as he walked around, as they celebrated the funeral for 3 days, and then he was walking around after. The lame had walked, the blind had seen, the lepers were healed, news was spread. There's too many miracles to deny it. They weren't denying that he couldn't do miracles. Perhaps maybe some of them thought, "Save yourself, like let's see you really get out of this one. I want a free show." But if Jesus would have done that, if he would have acted on that, he would have died for you and I's sins. One of the criminals that was hanging beside Jesus says, "So you're the Messiah, are you? Prove it by saving yourself, and us too, while you're at it." But the other criminal protested, "Don't you fear God, even when you have been sentenced to die? We deserve to die for our crimes, but this man hasn't done anything wrong." And then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replied, "I assure you today, you will be with me in paradise." This is the physical thing that happened with Jesus on the cross. But we haven't even begun to understand the mental and the spiritual and the emotional side that was going on with Jesus. I will tell you this. It is reflected in his last words. There were 7 sayings on that cross that portray what Jesus was really going on in his mental and spiritual and emotional state at that moment. But we're going to go over those sayings next time when we actually go over the death of Jesus. But I'll end with this. The cross today is so symbolic. We wear crosses around our neck. We wear crosses on things because we remember Jesus dying on the cross for us. But I want you to understand that happened hundreds of years after the crucifixion of Jesus, that the cross became a symbol of something good and something powerful. At this moment, the cross is the most shameful death you can possibly go and happen to you. As the whole city looks on and sees Jesus on the hill of this cross, shame is what it's supposed to bring to Jesus, to his followers. But we know that even through that shame, there is hope. There was something new forming as this new covenant is happening. But we'll keep going on. And next time we're going to dig into how Jesus truly died for you and I's sins.